think a lot of these things came through in the discussion in the two presentations we just had, and just slightly different flavors, so to speak. So the same question we talked about earlier, do you agree with the goals? What would you change and how, if you had any changes? I only see, how many is that? 10 people on video, but we have 16 in the group. So I just want to make sure that we all have a chance to comment on this. So does anybody want to go first as to what might be missing, or what might need to be changed, or what needs to be added that would add an element of this sustainability, resilience, and transparency?
I'll jump in maybe just to say, yes, I agree with Jana in terms of sort of building upon the community and primary care infrastructure beyond the academic medical centers. You know, we certainly know that even when those of us who are funding research in the NGO or federal space, they're straining under the weight. So we need to, in fact, diversify, as we were talking earlier, you know, the ability to do research at the community level. And some of the infrastructure is laid through agencies like the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality with the practice-based research networks. The challenge in all of these goals of trying to build it into the healthcare system, the most worthy goal, you know, the city on the hill of the learning healthcare system is, you know, the healthcare system is already straining at the seams just to deliver care, and how that can be enabled with, you know, some of the things we've talked about previously through support, I think will build trust in the community and build the infrastructure at the same time.
I think that's part of the sustainability. If we create trials that are, and I'm not advocating for large, simple trials for everything, I'm really not, but what I am advocating for is that probably every trial we do could be simpler than what how we currently conduct it. So not everything needs to be simple, but everything should probably be a little bit simpler. And there are examples where a large, simple trial has been able to be integrated into the community, as with recovery. And yes, it's a different country, different system, but the principles apply. And I think it's also not advocating about, I think it's about dividing and conquering. Like academic centers certainly have their role in providing evidence generation, but I think the community can also help create evidence that we haven't really tapped into. And Jonathan, UCI, I imagine you at UC Irvine, so as an academic center, do you have any thoughts on sort of how we can, and how the academic centers can help engage with the community potentially too? It doesn't have to be an either or, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think a lot of the conversations that I'm having with the, you know, there's a real component of the digital health folks trying to assist in improving accrual and making it, a lot of it really is just to improve speed and scale. So if we can find a way to make trials more open and more reflective, I think it adds the ability to more rapidly accrue and more rapidly, or increase the odds that you're going to complete. So I think that's what we learned a lot from the real world evidence workshop, is that so many of these trials, just in order to number, just they can't get started or they can't finish because of challenges in recruitment. And so that's certainly what we're considering, is how we can better deploy the EHR or other methods, MyChart, what have you, to aid the clinical trials recruitment process. And as has been mentioned, try to improve the number of clinicians that are involved in that.
So is there an element, I mean, I think the use of technology is in a different section in some ways, but obviously this cannot be devoid of technologies if you want to sort of scale and make it simpler and more embedded. I mean, EHRs come to mind. Those are all technological opportunities, but I guess we need to separate that out and maybe not make that one of the things that's missing. It's hard to separate them all out.
I have a comment, Pamela, in terms of the crappy trials you talked about, and also with it related to the recruitment issues. If you look at the IRBs who are approving these trials from a particular perspective, they could play probably a bigger role in order to avoid these kind of crappy trials to be taking place, because they could put in particular standards which permits to ask for the outcome, what kind of result these kind of trials should be providing. And if the trial setup is simply not adequate, then that would certainly show during that analysis. In terms of the recruitment of trials, I've seen in the past, recruitment always has been a difficult issue. Many companies are doing exploratory assessments in terms of how many patients could be recruited in different settings and centers. But these are guesses. But what I have learned from these processes, they are very inadequate and lead very often to wrong numbers. And so that whole process could be improved, in my view. In addition to that, what we saw from Elliot Levy in terms of data, data sharing, in my view, is very important in order to come up with clinical trial simulation tools. And clinical trial simulation tools can really narrow down the populations you want to look at. And also in terms of the availability of those populations can help to foster the clinical trials. So.
Yes, thank you. I think that's true. I think that's definitely true. Any other thoughts? Like, it doesn't sound like anything is necessarily up for change in these goals. Am I hearing that right? That these are pretty good? Do you find there needs to be something added? Sam, I see you sort of hesitating as if you want to say something.
Yeah, I throw out two potential adds to this list. So the first, I think, is greater coordination between regulators and industry on which new trial methods will ultimately pass review. So I've seen from a lot of folks in the industry who might be considering new innovative methods that one of the biggest questions is whenever it goes to review at CDER or CBER or wherever it ultimately lands, are those novel methods ultimately going to be acceptable to FDA, and will there be the appropriate expertise in place to be able to review those data generated through novel methods? And that can be everything from the development of new measures to data that has a different provenance than the traditional data that we bring in through EDCs. And this is something that I think can be tackled through more coordination at the trial planning stages. And also, as those discussions occur, expanding the ability of FDA to hire for the appropriate expertise to support pull-through of these new methods. And another thing I'd put out there is, to the point on how do we meld together clinical trials and clinical care? A couple of folks have raised the point that there is tremendous volumes of data that are being generated of kind of N=1 experiments today in clinical care. And a lot of those insights are kind of being left on the threshing room floor. And so, it's not a panacea to our problems of medical research and clinical innovation. But I think that there is something when we think about the 2030 clinical trials enterprise of how do we reduce the data entry burden on site staff or enable pragmatic data collection so we can support more decentralized studies through responsibly ingesting with patient consent some of these data feeds that are being generated through other sources that can either help with the monitoring of risk for these patients to more confidently deploy studies without a centralized site hub, or to support the collection of data for even primary and secondary endpoints. So I think that there's a lot that we can do in those areas to make our studies more efficient.
So to pick up on that last point, I'm going to ask Linda if you have any comments, because I know with the Champions Metrics Consortium, we were sort of looking at some of these things. And then I'd like Michelle to maybe comment on the regulatory capacity. I mean, I've never seen that there was a lack of willingness and capacity, but maybe we can talk about. First, Linda, I'll ask you to sort of comment on the last issues.
Well, I think the whole issue of managing change and how do you put incentives in place to help support change are really important. And right now, I mean, organizations are just struggling even getting risk-based quality management in place. That, you know, it's one thing to sort of create frameworks, but really changing the way that we look at data, how we use analytics to tell us things that used to require people, it's very slow going. People are really struggling on the operational side. And we haven't even brought in what happens when all this data starts flowing in through, you know, mobile technology and all of that, and sort of how does data look different and how do we monitor it? So there's a lot of things trying to change at once. And I think these things take longer. People want to do things because it's the right thing to do, but trying to get everything in place to support it and to reward for doing it the new way is something that we talk a lot about right now at the consortium.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would also argue that a pandemic is sort of like an impetus for a lot of change, that you kind of don't have a choice. And I hope we look at it that way. And Jenna did point to that a little bit, like, is there incentive to change the system that we have or not, or willingness to change? Michelle, I'm not going to ask you to comment on that specifically from the regulatory perspective, but do you have any thoughts on what Sam mentioned earlier, like the capacity for novel designs and sort of the regulatory thought process around that?
So I'll just speak from the perspective of the Center for Devices, because that's
right,
the center that I'm part of. I won't comment on biologics or drugs.
Right.
But I do think that there is the opportunity for, we use real world evidence in a lot of our device decisions, but I think there are opportunities to enrich that real world evidence stream. In particular, if we talked about diversity, we know that electronic health records are notorious for poorly collecting race and ethnicity data. And in fact, collecting gender data, we report what we think gender is and not necessarily what it truly is. And so, you know, I do think that those kinds of elements, if we could use some standard data capture for those kinds of things, it would be helpful so that we can get that reflected in the data sets. Another thing that I think we've alluded to is the importance of parallel development. There are tools that are being created, all kinds of ways of monitoring patients in the real world. But what do we do? I think, Linda, you alluded to that, with all this data. And who's responsible for acting on all that data? It's a lot to work in terms of if it's going to populate in the EHR. Physicians are going to be responsible for that. And there's malpractice considerations, a whole lot of other ethical concerns that, you know, while we're building a clinical trial enterprise, we also have to think about the unintended consequences on the rest of the ecosystem. So I do think that, you know, that may, I don't know if it's reflected in the elements that are listed here, but I do think that that's an important, you know, an important consideration because there are nurses, doctors that are just doing clinical care that now are going to be responsible if the Apple Watch that was looking at the arrhythmia all of a sudden fires. Now, what am I supposed to do? So that's why I say maybe that, and I don't know, I don't think it's reflected in the points that I see, but considerations of other folks.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And we know it's possible if you boil it down to having it as embedded is, I mean, that's the word different, but as sort of integrated into care as possible, then if you're not asking people to do many extra things, some of this is more possible, but thinking that through, there might be something missing about technology in these goals a little bit, even though it is in the next session, but then maybe also the other sort of thing that you mentioned about sort of the regulatory ways of handling that. And I mean, I think the Digital Health Center of Excellence is that kind of shows the willingness to sort of work with some of that stuff. I'm still looking for a rapporteur. I don't know if some of you are willing to step forward, but whoever it is going to have to, those are the two things I think from the discussion, which is very good. I think it's time to maybe switch again to sort of, okay.
Hi, this is Lee Fleischer. Can I make a comment?
Sure. I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Lee Fleischer. I didn't join this morning. I'm a member of the NAM, but I'm the Chief Medical Officer of CMS. And as we look to the future, and I look towards how I'm building out the data infrastructure for quality, and you'll forgive me, I'm actually driving back from Philly to my apartment in Baltimore. We're looking at using FHIR APRs and being able to pull the data from the EHR. So I think we really have to look at what the data infrastructure will be 5 years from now as far as the pull, if we get that, and also thinking about the data I sit on at CMS, how do we integrate that into our thoughts about pragmatic clinical trials? Thank you.
I appreciate those comments a lot. Thank you. All right, so I think that's another element that we could add maybe to something that's a little bit, could be added to the goals. I'm hoping somebody's keeping track of this and is going to report on this. Next are sort of, again, what are the short-term things that get us on the way to this sustainable, transparent, and resilient system? And I think earlier we talked about investment for the previous session as sort of a very actionable thing. A lot's been happening to get this started. You know, what else are some actions that need to be met by, say, 2025, which is 4 years from now? 4 years from now. So any thoughts there?
I was thinking maybe we could have agreed upon the sort of parameters and metrics, sort of a minimum requirements for clinical trials, for instance, so that you there's the right type of control, certain numbers. That would certainly help centralize some of the issues we've been seeing.
Are you talking about standardized, when you say standardized metrics, are you saying like standardized endpoints, more so that everybody's thinking
endpoints? Also what Michelle had mentioned with the EHRs and having sort of a certain amount of information that's collected that we could ask everybody to, I think that's relatively like a low-hanging fruit, but sort of trying to push this action forward would help.
I think that makes good sense. Deborah Zarin and someone else has done some work in COVID specifically, and even within COVID treatment trials, there were many different scales used, many different, you know, sort of endpoints used that really don't help us down the road. So I think that could be some action around harmonizing around the things you want to collect and how to do it.
Or to build out on that a little bit, the use of core outcome data sets, in some ways, it might allow you to take a number of small, crappy trials and have a larger study that is.
And combine them at least, yeah. Yeah. And just so you know, they're not, I mean, when we talk about small, crappy, we mean non-randomized, potentially too small to be powered, so you can't really. Some trials are small and have to be small and are good in their smallness, but some just are not. Yeah, but it would be good already if you could combine them, right? Yeah.
Well, even the foundational work, you know, in some kind of registry, you know, observational data can be a good start to pointing you to how you would design your randomized trial. It tells you patterns of care, natural history as much as you can, you know, discern it. It's a good foundation.
I mean, is there a way to harness, I mean, I don't know how many lessons learned documents there are from the pandemic, but there's many and they're good. Is that a short-term item to really sort of make sure that some of those things stick? And I think they point to some of the things that were said earlier already.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I mean, I think that there's a group of us from this from the forum that I think we've got a series coming out that's certainly been informed in the COVID experience in terms of how we can better design pragmatic clinical trials. But I think what we've learned from particularly from the developing registry and the observational data world is what's been mentioned by several is there's just a lot of issues with the EHR. So to make sure that we can those things are sorted out. So when we do these trials, that we can measure what we'd like. You know, I'm working with a COVID data set, and sometimes when it says that the medication was administered inpatient, it turns out the patient was never even admitted. So trying to get to those issues where all these things are actually harmonized, because sometimes these things, the OMOP language or some of the EHR language was designed never quite thinking there would be the urgency that there is to make sure it's correct. It's pretty good, but there's a fair amount of error sometimes that we've detected, where the signals that should mean the same thing don't, and then you find out there's a pretty good reason why they don't. But it's still, if you did not know that, you would come to a spurious conclusion. And so so that notion that you need to QC, but ideally we could set up the infrastructure so it was correct when we do these trials. So when we deploy them, it gives us the correct measurements. And I think that's certainly something we've learned from the pandemic. So applying a lot of these lessons will, as you mentioned, Pamela, is just, that's what we probably need to do, is all the things that we learned in terms of it kind of showed the warts of how we do a lot of things.
Yeah, switching that conversation to stakeholders, you know, there's maybe clinical trials are not your grandmother's clinical trials anymore, right? There's many new stakeholders, and some of those will play a role in these. So is EHRs or others ones that we need to start thinking of? And then maybe as we look at what Janet was talking about, that community network of clinical trials, how can we engage with the community stakeholders in a way that is win-win, right? So it's not like we need something from you and, you know, thank you at the end of the day, but it's win-win, and everybody, you know, it's for the best of everyone. Martin Lander the other day said at a meeting that, you know, if we're all supposed to be working on evidence-based medicine, then, you know, as a medical society, we should be providing that evidence for us to then use down the road. And it's upon everyone. But yeah, what other stakeholders, maybe newer ones, might help us get to this vision of sustainability, transparency, and resilience? Patience was mentioned in the Slack channel. Any thoughts on, so I think everybody, oh no, I'm the only one who can see it. So that would including patient endpoints help reduce the number of trials that don't generate endpoints? I mean, I think the larger question is, would including the patient perspective when you design a trial help us reduce trials that do not generate evidence? I personally think that probably would happen. Any thoughts on your end on that comment? Michelle, did I just see you? Okay, perfect. Yeah.
It's Heather. I could take that one just from a sponsor's perspective, that I am sure all of us, I speak for all of us, that we're all pulling in patient perspective, patient forums, are generating patient insights groups to start pulling that into the clinical development plans and across the board. Partly as a result of COVID, really what we were planning in the first place, and now just COVID gave us the accelerator, is really looking at the protocols, looking at the schedule events, and purposefully making decisions that reduce patient burden. And what is interesting is that in some cases, what you think may be reducing a patient burden isn't. So we talk about remote data collection, but if that means remote data collection off of 3 different devices, is that really helpful? Is it during the summer and you're giving them an arm patch? You know, it's those types of things that get to the soft things where you really need to understand, like almost the it's called like the ethnography of the disease. So basically, how does that patient live throughout the day? Like I get up in the morning and guess what? I have to go feed my kid, but because of the pain in my back, I can't lean over. So it's not really the fact that I'm coughing so much, it's the fact that I coughed and it gave me back problems and I can't bend over. You know, so those are the things that I think all pharma companies really are trying to do right now, but it's difficult because similar to what we talked about when we were discussing finding the patients, you can't always generalize the patient population and what they want.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to ask Michelle if you, because you were going to say something too, and then we might be switched over back to the general session in a few minutes here. Peyton, I'm going to count on you. I kind of took your little, yes.
I think I have it. I've been trying to catch up.
Well, I was just going to comment, from the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, as you probably are aware, we put forward draft guidance documents encouraging the medical device industry to consider engaging with patients in the design of and conduct of clinical investigations. And for the very point that I think Heather alluded to, which is there are so many different aspects that we may not think of, that people who day to day have to go to those site visits and bring, collect data remotely. What's the burden on them and what's the value add for them? Because they are donating their time, even compensation that we give to patients. There is a huge commitment to be sustained in a trial, and so making sure they're as least burdensome as possible on them with the amount of data we need to make a decision. And we want good quality data. I think to the point when patients are engaged in designing the trial, we ensure that there's value add for the outcomes that are being assessed. They're more likely to complete those patient-reported outcome measures or other assessments if they see why they're doing it and they understand the importance of it in the clinical trial process. So I think that our center has come out very strongly with that, with the draft guidance, and it was also informed by our patient engagement advisory committee meeting where the patients themselves spoke to the importance of that inclusion.
Yeah, and I think Nadine mentioned community-based pharmacists as well. And I think as you design trials, especially when you start going out in the community, involving all those community members in how your trial may or may not work will be really helpful. And it becomes complex in planning because it's all of a sudden a lot of opinions that you and ideas you need to incorporate. But sometimes if you plan it up front, you don't have the amendments down the road either. So there's probably benefit in thinking that through ahead of time.
Pamela, thank you so much. I can't come on my video right now, so apologies, but this conversation has been fantastic. But yes, I actually kind of wanted to piggyback with the second part of my comment in the chat regarding what Heather said, and also Michelle as well, specifically on even thinking about the patient experience and really kind of honing in more on what is the patient's experience in clinical trials and how can we ensure that that informs how we move forward with the work that we do in terms of across the board in terms of clinical trials, pragmatic trials, et cetera. So I just think in really moving that evidence of the literature, although scant, but the evidence of the literature actually into informing what actually happens as we design and develop and implement clinical trials. And then I think the other part is thinking about race-based medicine and race-based research. And oftentimes when we think about race and it being a social construct and even how people may identify based on race and ethnicity, and how does that impact what we're doing as it relates to clinical research and trials. So really having some more clear discussions around that can actually lead to how we practice and how we move forward in advancing clinical research and trials, I think is also important.